Quote, while interactive platforms improve the perceived learning compared to other methods, educational videos also provide a sense of confidence among learners. Although our findings do not show any impact on actual learning, the gap between confidence in applying algorithmic techniques and perceived knowledge suggests that educational videos, when used in isolation, may be detrimental to learning by providing an illusion of confidence. End quote. That's from page 783 of the article titled Mind the Gap, the Illusion of Skill Acquisition in Computational Thinking, which was written by Yereng Bao and Bao Hosseini. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, with the advent of online educational platforms and the advances in pedagogical techniques, self-directed learning has emerged as one of the most popular modes of learning. Distance education, elevated by the COVID-19 pandemic, involves methods of instruction through a variety of remote activities which only rely on educational videos for mastery. In the absence of direct student engagement, the asynchronous nature of remote activities may deteriorate the quality of education for learners. Students often have an illusion of skill acquisition after watching videos, which results in overestimation of abilities and skills. We focus on the efficacy of skill acquisition through interactive technologies and assess their impact on computational thinking in comparison with delivery through other traditional media, e.g., videos and text. In particular, we investigate the relationship between actual learning, perception of learning, and learners' confidence in adult learners. Our results reveal intriguing observations about the role of interactivity and visualization and their implications on the pedagogical design for self-directed learning modules. End quote. If I were to summarize this article into a single sentence, I'd say that this article compares learning, perceptions of learning, and confidence among adult learners participating in interactive, video-based, and text-based learning. And as always, in the show notes, you can find the link to this article, as well as over 180 other podcast episodes that have interviews with guests or multiple guests, or these like solo episodes where I unpack implications of scholarship for computer science educators. In addition, if you go to my website, jaredoleary.com, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science education resources, as well as a bunch of gaming and drumming stuff because I create content for a living. Now, even though this article is talking about adult learners, I'm going to talk about what this looks like in K-12 classes, as well as just computer science education classes in particular. Now, if you don't know who I am, I have a background working with all grades, kindergarten through doctoral student, in a variety of different contexts like music education and computer science education classes. And my CV is linked on my website if you're interested in that kind of nerdiness. Now, in the introduction of this article, the authors talk about how there can be an illusion of skill acquisition for people who learn something by watching a video. So in the introduction, they talk about how there are some self-directed learning platforms, like think of Khan Academy, which has like a bunch of math stuff, as well as some computer science education and web development courses. And then they unpack what they mean by computational thinking, which, as I've talked about in other episodes, is a very messy term that means many different things to many different people. And here are the questions that kind of guide this particular study. This is from page 778. Quote, is there an illusion of skill acquisition in teaching computational thinking through a variety of learning technologies? Is there a gap between the perception of learning, actual learning comprehension, and learners' confidence? End quote. Those are some really important questions to consider. I've done some publications and even some podcast episodes that kind of unpack self-efficacy of like teachers and learners, which isn't to say that those are two separate things, but basically to say between adults and kids. But just because people gain confidence in being able to do something doesn't mean they're actually better at doing that thing. Now, as an example of that, because I have like a drum kit right behind me, I could show you a bunch of videos that would teach you how to develop limb independence to make it so that your two hands do two different things separate from your 2 feet. And even your mouth. You could have 5-way independence while playing on the drums. And I could show you many different videos on how to develop that, and it would make sense. And you go, oh, that makes sense. However, actually putting it into practice is a completely different thing. You have to develop the myelination and the neural connections across your brain to actually be able to make it so that your limbs can basically interact in an interdependent way. So there's a difference between understanding and skill, or even confidence in understanding and actual application of that understanding. Same thing applies for computer science. So if we're talking about programming here, I might be able to conceptually understand an idea or an algorithm or whatever, but actually applying that and creating that on my own and putting it into use within a program, that's a completely different skill set. Which one do you value or focus on in your classes that you work with? So this paper is going to kind of explore that a little bit. Now, if you're interested in section 1.1, it's titled Our Contributions. So this is on page 779. Kind of gives an overview of learning comprehension, perception of learning, and confidence and interest in learning, and gives like a summary of the paper itself. So if you want a very quick read of that, go ahead and take a look at that. But this podcast will also kind of unpack each of those areas. And then in section 1.2, they talk about some related work, so you can find some studies that are related to this in some way. All right, so section 2 is on design and development. So they kind of unpack, well, what was the interactive platform? How did this compare with the educational videos? And how did this compare with the text-based instruction? So all three were kind of given to different groups. If you want to learn more about that, check out section 2.1 and 2.2. And if you want to learn more about the experimental design, I really appreciate the authors that actually gave a deep dive into here's exactly what our demographic survey looked like, or here's what our assignment and workflow will look like, etc. So that is all discussed on page 780 in the experimental design, as well as in 781 and a little bit in 782. I'm not going to nerd out on that in this episode, but it is worth reading if you're interested in that. So you can hopefully replicate this kind of study or design to see if you get similar or different findings with your different populations. All right, so let's get nerdy and talk about the results. So this is starting on page 782. So 4.1 is on the perception of learning. So in this section, they kind of talk about the perception of learning as well as their confidence with learning. Here's a quote from page 782. Quote, while the learners of the interactive group reported significantly higher score for perceived comprehension in contrast to video and text-based groups, the participants in the video groups were as confident about their knowledge as those in the interactive group. This finding suggests that educational videos may lead learners to develop overconfidence about the subject matter. In contrast, interactivity provides an opportunity for learners to get their hands dirty by manipulating the input and directly interacting with the algorithms, which in turn aligns learners' perceived comprehension with confidence, end quote. Now, this is really important to consider. So it's great that videos might be able to help improve confidence with learning or understanding something, but the interactivity actually made it so that they were able to apply their understanding in some way and kind of maybe get some feedback in terms of what worked and what did not work, depending on what kind of feedback you get from the platform. Again, it's one thing to be able to understand something, and it's a completely different thing to be able to actually apply that understanding consistently. Now, what does this mean for educators? So for myself, what I really tried to focus on was maybe introducing a concept at the beginning of a class in the first 5 minutes out of a 40-minute period at most. And then the rest of the time was actually students being able to apply that understanding in their own projects or explore it in different ways. So if everybody happened to be working on the exact same thing, which was a very rare circumstance in the classes that I work with, because everybody was able to pick a number of different projects with a number of different programming languages and platforms, etc., and apply it in a meaningful way. But in the few instances where students were all working on the exact same thing, I would spend some time introducing an idea, and then that would take up a very small percentage of the time. The rest of the time would be spent applying that and me working with students one-on-one, kind of coaching them, or having their peers kind of coach each other. Now, if this had been flipped, this would have maybe looked like 35 minutes of video-based lecture or me at the front of the room kind of talking about things and 5 minutes of application. While that time spent learning from an expert, whether it's from a video, from a teacher, or whatever, may have developed some sense of confidence of understanding that subject area, the actual application of that understanding is a very small percentage of time. So I've talked about in other podcasts, if we think of music or language or any kind of skill or understanding, you need to be able to actually practice it to improve at it and apply it in different contexts, to constantly look at a concept or practice from many different angles and many different perspectives to better understand how to use it and modify it in different scenarios. So for example, if you're learning something like a for loop, if you only go and create one for loop and don't understand how it works in other programs, in other contexts, other scenarios, etc., you're going to have a very narrow understanding and not understand how to use it in many different scenarios, or when to use it in comparison to a while loop or something else. How much time you actually spend exploring those different scenarios as opposed to just learning the concept itself will have a direct impact on how good you are at that. It's the same thing with learning a language or an instrument or a sport or whatever. You can't just watch videos of people teaching you how to do it. You actually need to do it. So a recommendation that I might give is that while students might have an increased sense of confidence with learning something from a lecture or a video or whatever, you need to actually really think through how much time are we actually spending applying that understanding, because that will have an impact on learning, which, speaking of, 4.2 is on the actual learning comprehension. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the authors found no statistically significant difference between learning comprehension among the interactive group and the video group. So again, even though they had an increase in confidence, they did not have an increase in actual learning comprehension. But what about with the interest in learning? Well, 4.3 kind of talks about that very quickly. Now, when the authors compared the text-based group with the video group, there was an increase in interest among the video group. However, there was not a statistically significant difference between the video group and the interactive group. If you have an option of being able to hand a textbook to a student or an interactive platform online or a video on how to do something, in this particular study, it appears that the textbook would be the least interesting to some adult learners, and maybe the most interesting would be the video or the interactive platform. I would argue that kind of depends on what the content is that is being taught and who you are teaching it to, or who is learning that content. But in general, I could totally see why video and interactive media would be more interesting or more engaging than just reading through text. Now, under 4.4, they talk about usability. So this is a quote from page 782 that kind of talks about, well, how do these three groups compare? Quote, first, the interactive treatment required participants to proactively engage in the learning process by manipulating the input. Thus, more effort is required in this mode compared to the video group. Second, the educational videos contained audio in addition to the visual explanation. We hypothesize that audio can have an important impact on the overall learning experience. As expected, those in the text-based group were less satisfied and found the instructions complicated and sometimes confusing, end quote. Now, if you look into like studies on learning theories and like cognitive load theory, etc., you'll find that like mixed media, like something like a video that has like visuals and audio going on simultaneously might be more interactive and more interesting than something that's just text-based, but it really kind of depends on how it's presented. Like there are ways to create videos that maximize cognitive load and make it so that it's very confusing, just like with text. But as I've mentioned in many other episodes, the more ways that you can kind of like take a multi-perspectival approach or look at something from many different angles, the better. So with the text, it's a little bit harder to do that. You could do that with different stories, different vignettes, kind of explaining different applications of things, or you could actually just show that through a media like a video. But again, different contexts, different scenarios, different applications, it kind of depends on what students are learning and whether or not that would be more valuable than just having a conversation or reading something about it. Now, in section 5, they talk about the positive correlations that they found in this. So an example of a positive correlation would be the correlation between actual learning comprehension with the perception of learning. So if students had a higher perception of learning, they would likely have a higher learning comprehension, and vice versa. They also found a positive correlation between usability and learning. So the more usable something is, then the better it's going to be for people to learn that thing. And then section 6 talks about limitations and lessons learned, and then section 7 talks about some of the concluding marks. If you're interested in reading that, I recommend taking a look at those sections, which again, I linked to this paper in the show notes. Now, at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to share some lingering questions and thoughts just to kind of share, here are some things that I was thinking of that maybe you'd be interested in exploring as well. So one of the questions that I have is, how do you know when a student understands something? So an example that I've given in other podcast episodes is when I used to teach in a K-8 district that I was working in. I was kind of like the mentor for the coding teachers in there. One of the conversations that we had one day was looking at different student projects. And so this was using Khan Academy's interactive coding platform, which made it so that students were using JavaScript to be able to create art and animation. One of the projects had students creating pizza. So it's like a visual depiction of pizza like on a plate or on a dinner table or whatever. Students could kind of be creative with this. And so they're creating the different shapes to represent the different toppings on the pizza, different slices, or maybe a full pie of pizza, whatever. Now, one of the examples that we looked at, it had this really detailed, there's like really neat depiction of what pizza might look like with code. In terms of like how it looked, it was like a standout compared to every single one of the other projects. Like if this project was a 10, all the other projects were like a 7. However, when we actually looked at the code, it was very clear just looking at the code that the student didn't understand loops, as well as didn't understand some of the shape commands, etc. So in terms of the overall product, it was phenomenal. But in terms of like the demonstration of understanding, it actually demonstrated they didn't understand what they were doing, and they kind of happened to have some happy accidents that made a really interesting looking project that didn't actually demonstrate that they knew what they were doing. So it's important for researchers and for educators to really think through how you're actually going to check for understanding. Are you just going to look at the end result? Are you going to look at the process that they took to get that end result? Are you going to look at the final code? Are you going to actually ask them, even if their code looks great, and you look at it and you're like, there's no flaws here, like this is very efficient and effective use of code, it looks great, but do they understand it? If you sit down with a student and you say, can you explain to me what this function does? Can they do that? But to argue with myself, does being able to demonstrate something tacitly have more or less value than be able to explain how to do that very thing? Now, this is something that I talked about in episode 89, which is titled Applications of Affinity Space Characteristics in Computer Science Education. And I've related it to musicians. So do you want to be able to have it so that a musician can play a solo or be able to explain how to play the solo? Which one are you valuing or assessing for? Same thing with coding. Do you want to see that students can be able to actually create the thing or finish an app or a program or whatever, or be able to explain how to do that? Where along the continuum between the application of understanding and explanation of understanding do you want them to lie? Are they going to be somewhere right in the middle where they can do both, or is it going to be leaning towards one or the other? Depending on how you answer this is going to kind of depend on what kind of assessment you end up using, which I talked about in many other assessment-related episodes that I'll link to in the show notes. Now, another question that I have is how important is it to various stakeholders that students understand CS? And then how does that compare with motivation for students to want to continue learning something? I ask this because there's like different community members or even like corporations or like administrators or whatever. They all have kind of different like weights given towards the value of computer science for students to be able to learn. But what's not often discussed is the motivation to actually continue to learn something. So are we just trying to get a future population of voters to a base level understanding of what computer science is? Or are we trying to motivate people to actually want to continue to learn computer science after the course is done? So is the focus on your 6 to 9 to 12 month course and just making sure that students learn the content or the standards or whatever within that particular period of time? Or is it to develop lifelong learners over an extended period of time? As I've talked about in other episodes, like on Serious Leisure, are we going to encourage students to mod, as I did when proposing to my wife through Minecraft, and engage in other leisurely pursuits of computer science and whatnot? Or are we just focusing on developing citizens who understand computer science, or developing future programmers, etc.? Depending on what you focus on, whether it's the understanding, application of understanding, or motivation to continue to learn it, it's going to kind of like determine what kind of an approach you use in your classroom. So something important to consider when designing classes. What is your focus on? Is your focus on understanding? Is your focus on application of understanding? Or is your focus on developing lifelong learning? Or is it a combination of those in different ways? So I had a conversation with somebody earlier this week. That person was talking about how their kid was having to label the parts of a microscope in class. And they're like, cool, that's great. I'm glad you're able to do that. But what did you see when you looked through the microscope? And the kid's like, well, we actually didn't even get to touch the microscope. We were just labeling the parts of it. That to me is just focusing on understanding like a set of standards, not actually investigating and exploring and applying those understandings to figure out, well, what does like a cell structure actually look like when I look through this? How do I actually zoom in and zoom out with the different parts of the microscope? When would I even use a microscope? Instead, we're focusing so much on just like rote labeling and understanding rather than applying the understanding and exploring or engaging in an inquiry or whatever. Now, that approach would have, in my opinion, a profoundly negative impact on learning. It's going to make it so students look at science and go, this is boring. It's like what my math and like history classes were like. We were learning facts, we were learning how to solve problems, but we didn't know when we'd use that. We didn't know why these facts were important. It was just memorize this date for the test and then forget it after that. As CS educators, we really need to make sure that like we learn from the mistakes that you may have experienced as a student and go, well, that didn't work for me or my peers. How can I take that failure for myself and for my peers and actually make it so the students that I work with don't have to suffer through that in the classes that I design, etc. But another question that I posed, and this was like in episode 66, which was titled The Role of Deliberate Practice in the Acquisition of Expert Performance, is how do you develop expertise over time? So I was previously in a K6 school and a K8 school, but I've also taught high school. So at minimum, I would see students for a few years. Even when I taught undergraduate and graduate courses, I got to see them over multiple years, multiple courses, etc. It was very rarely would I only see students for like a year or a semester. When thinking about those kinds of classes, like in the K8 classes, there was 9 years that I could potentially see those students. I was trying to think of how to make it so that I could develop expertise from kindergarten all the way to 9 years later when they got into 8th grade. What did I want them to be able to know and be able to understand and be able to explore or create or express themselves, etc. across that 9-year period of time? How you develop expertise over that time is very different than focusing on a single class where I'm only going to see these students for a single quarter, semester, year, or whatever. If you're only focusing on that and you're not thinking of that long-term development of expertise, then we're going to, in my opinion, shortchange the students. Rather than focusing on lifelong learning of computer science, we would instead focus on just learning facts, figures, standards, etc., without actually thinking about how to apply it over the course of a lifetime. Because computer science is just constantly changing and evolving. I mean, think of like the developments in AI within the last year alone. This is going to continue and likely accelerate over time. If all we do is focus on the concepts and practices and skills and understandings that are important today, we're going to fail the students who are going to be out of the schools 10 years from now. Instead, I think, in my opinion, we should focus on developing lifelong expertise and teaching students how to develop that expertise when an adult is no longer present to help guide them. The ability to be able to learn how to learn is more important than whatever facts and figures you can learn and across your K-12 tenure. Same thing with like undergrad and graduate classes. The way that I designed every class that I ever worked with, kindergarten all the way through graduate student, was constantly trying to focus on not just what they needed to know in that moment, but how to also learn that down the road when I was no longer with them in those classes. So a challenge for you, listener, is that when you are designing your classes, think of not only what you're going to do within that quarter, semester, or year, or however long you're working with your students, but think about how you're going to encourage them to continue to develop their learning and refine their understanding at the conclusion of whatever class you are designing. If we can do that, then perhaps we can have some lifelong learners who are interested in computer science, whether or not they even decide to pursue a career in it. I hope this episode was an interesting study for you to look at. I know it was for me to consider the different comparisons between like text-based, interactive, and video-based lessons. I personally think we need more of this in computer science education research and just education research in general. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever app you're listening to this on. There's over 180 other episodes. There's some phenomenal guests on this podcast, as well as many other episodes that explore different topics. And you can find a link to that in whatever app you're listening to this on, or just by going to jaredoleary.com. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Till then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.